Right, so we've looked at how natural selection can act on adaptations. Those adaptations can be favorable and it changes the allele frequency over time in a population. Now we're going to actually look at how that accumulation of different gene frequencies and different mutations can over time start to change an organism until it turns into a species. And the first thing we're going to look at is the actual patterns of evolution, or the modes under which we say this happens. There are more than what we will study in this course, okay, but we're going to look at the two main types of evolutionary pattern. So by the end of this, you should be able to link back the idea that skeletal structures can provide clues to the evolution of the organisms, looking at the similarities found between the different species. That you should be able to identify homologous structures in species and link this to how they evolved. To be able to identify analogous structures in species and explain how this can indicate how the species may have evolved as well. Which means that you need to be able to define the terms homologous structures and analogous structures and know what they mean. And then explain the differences between divergent and convergent evolution, which are the patterns of evolution that we will look at that give the structures of the skeleton give us clues about. So with skeletal structures, if we look at an organism, we can find similarities between many species. So we're going to look at two types of structures, homologous structures and analogous structures. So homologous structures, if we think back to, so homo being same, homogeneous solutions are the same throughout. Okay, so homologous structures means that they are the same. Okay, so that we can see here the radius of the forearm, this split forearm. This diagram is actually being colored to show the structures in a skeleton which are the same across mammals, showing that we had a common ancestor. Whereas analogous structures, okay, analogous means that they can act the same but are different structures. Okay, and the example that we see in our diagram here is streamlining that we see in different animals that live in the ocean. In this case, we can see the shark fins, the penguins, which are actually derived from birds, not fish, okay, and then the dolphin, which has a common ancestor with the mammals. So each of these are different classes of animals, and you may remember back to year 7 where we did, you might have done King Philip came over for Greek salad, which is kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. So what we're saying here is that these organisms, these animals in this case, are actually different classifications. Okay, so in this case we're talking all the way back up in the family and higher we have mammals, birds and fish, okay, whereas these ones are all mammals. So these ones, if they're the same type of organism, they're going to share a common ancestor. These derive from different evolutionary paths. So homologous structures occur in related species. They have the same basic structure, okay, but not necessarily the same function. And we can see that in the bone arrangement in these organisms a little bit closer up than what we had them on the first slide. We can see this forearm arrangement, the wrist and fingers, along with the upper arm into the shoulder. And we can see these structures in each one of these organisms, the human, cat, whale, and bat. Okay, so the human, this is our arm. This is one of the front forelegs of a cat, and the fin or flipper of a whale, and the wing of a bat. Each one of these has different different purpose. Bats, it's their wings, so it helps them to fly. Whale, it's their fins, so this is for swimming. Cats walk on four legs, where our arm we use for gripping and doing things like this. So they all have very different functions. And the overall idea, so we have 5 fingers and a thumb and things like that, these have changed shape over time to allow for their different function, but they came from a common ancestor. These bones all originated from an earlier ancestor of these organisms. That means that the bones have elongated or compressed, but we have the same overall skeletal structure, which tells us that at some point they had a common ancestor, and then they have each branched off into a different evolutionary path that has provided the different adaptations that we see in the way that their bones have changed. Analogous structures, on the other hand, occur in non-related species. Okay, so these are, for an example, butterflies, bats, and birds. They have the same function. So the appendage, or the characteristic we're talking about, has the same function, so they do the same job. Okay, but not the same basic structure, i.e. the bone structure is different. If we were to look at their skeletons, or in the case of this, the way the wings are formed, this is skin because the bat is a mammal. So they have skin that is stretched out between the bones, whereas our butterfly, which is an insect, has a completely different structure. There's no bones, so there's no bones inside this wing. It has fine scales and things like that. Okay, so the structure is very different, but they both perform the same function. They give the organism flight. Okay, so these organisms are not related and do not have a common ancestor. So this is starting from a different ancestral point, but having the same function, so becoming more similar over the time. Okay, so these functions, in the case of the bat, it might be large eyes, which you would see in other nocturnal animals. These evolve, okay, from different organisms, okay, because of similar selection pressures. Okay, so things like scarcity of food or predators, okay, the ability to camouflage and things like that would be due to predation and things like that. When you're talking about climate, remember that selection pressures can also be abiotic, so things like extreme temperatures in the desert. Okay, hot temperatures during the day mean that most of the organisms in the desert are nocturnal. They would run around at night because it's too hot during the day. So that would be a sign of them having, then due to being nocturnal, they would have a bunch of analogous structures. So a lot of organisms we see in the desert will have large eyes, be quite small so they don't lose too much water and things like that. So we would see analogous structures turn up in organisms that have the same kind of environmental selection pressures. So this leaves us with a comparison between the two. So homologous structures are due to common ancestry. So they have a common ancestor, have evolved from a single point, some point back in evolution. They will arise from divergent evolution, which we're about to talk about. And this limb, the pentadactyl, the 5 fingers that we see in vertebrates, so everything that has a backbone, has evolved from that. That's a common ancestor. Whereas analogous structures, due to common selection pressures, they arise via convergent evolution, which is our second type of evolution we're going to talk about. And we can see that in examples of things that have flight, such as wings in insects, birds, and bats. These all come from different classes of animal, okay, and have the same purpose.
Okay, whereas homologous structures will have a different purpose, as shown by the colors in this diagram, but similar structures. So we talked about convergent and divergent evolution. These are the two patterns that we need to know about. Convergent is what we see with analogous structures, as we said. So similar function coming from different points. Okay, so in this case we can see the fish family and Mammalia. This streamlined shape is due to convergent evolution. Divergent is when we get a junction point and something changes. Okay, so the junction point between organisms that had vertebrae or a backbone. Okay, and then one branch went to form mammals, the other branch went to form aquatic animals such as fish. Okay, this is divergent, when we get a branch that diverges away. So with divergent evolution, there is one parent species that gives rise to two species with different characteristics. Okay, this is due to the accumulation of differences between groups of the same species that will eventually lead to speciation and to new species. Different groups of the same species undergoing different selection pressures. So this is what we see with the finches that Darwin studied and the tortoises through the Galapagos Islands, okay, and the organisms that show divergent evolution with homologous structures. So this is what we were talking about before. We have variation in the population, and then selection pressures act on those. Eventually, these differences accumulate to be so much that you eventually end up with different species because of the accumulation of genetic variation, that they no longer can mate with each other and produce fertile offspring, so they would be considered different species. Convergent, on the other hand, doesn't end up with one species. It does end up with, I guess, the traits coming together. These are organisms that are not closely related, but independently evolve similar traits. So having to adapt to similar environments, like an aquatic environment or a desert environment or mountain, that kind of thing. So these organisms show convergent evolution because they would have analogous structures. So we look at their skeletons, they wouldn't show the same kind of structures that we saw with homologous structures, but we can identify different aspects that are very similar. So streamlining in the body shape to show decreased resistance through water that we see in dolphins, fish, reptiles, and birds that all live in the water but come from different ancestry. So that's it for our convergent and divergent evolution. This leaves you with the ability to complete the tasks on these in your booklet, which we will be looking at in class and going through a little bit more of classifying our classes of organisms so we can figure out which ones would have a common ancestor and wouldn't. And I'll see you in class.